I would like to introduce Professor Rodreck Mupedziswa. Okay, I'm sorry. Professor Rodreck is a professor of social work. In 2001, accepted a post as inaugural coordinator of the Center for Gender-Based Violence and Empowerment of Vulnerable Groups at the Bar Insago University in Gambura, Botswana. The center offers education and training programs, which is the diploma, bachelor's and master's degree in gender-based violence, community outreach and advocacy, and conducting research with a bias towards vulnerable groups. Prior to this appointment, he was based at the University of Botswana, UB, for a period spanning 15 years. March 2007 to March 2021, at the University of Botswana, he served as the head of the Department of Social Work for 6 years, between 2008 and 2014. And he became a full professor of social work for the remaining years of the period. Previous positions held by Professor Mupedziswa include director of the Forced Migration Studies program in the Graduate School for Humanities at the University of Wits in Johannesburg between 2002 to 2004. And he became the deputy director of the School of Social Work at the University of Zimbabwe, 1989 to 2001. Professor Mupedziswa research interest focused essentially on things that aim to empower vulnerable groups in society, including women and children. Of late, he has researched and published on the themes of social impact of climate change, especially vulnerable groups, with particular focus on the situation in Southern African region. He has unbridled passion for empowerment of vulnerable population in the society. Interestingly, Professor Rodreck has been one of those mentors many of us who are young scholars in the field of social work have been reading about. I feel so delighted. I feel so honored to be reading your citation. And then on this note, I want everyone to give him a round of applause as he shares his screen.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mugumbate, you got my, okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Let me begin by saying Happy Africa Day to everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you so clearly, sir.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. And all protocol observed. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this as one of the speakers. And to begin by congratulating my colleague from Mauritius for scooping the prize. That is something really to cherish. Incidentally, for the past 4 years, I was an external examiner at the University of Mauritius. The first 2 years, I would fly to Mauritius, but COVID came, and then we ended up doing things by remote. I should also mention that Professor Rasul, I really want to thank you for your presentation, because we have something in common, issues around gender-based violence. Let me go to the introduction now. Yes, the paper that I am presenting is titled The Quest for Relevance, Rethinking Strategies for Practical Field Component of Social Work Education. That is my focus, and I should mention that I chose to talk about social work education because the thinking is that if the education is done well, then it may follow that the practice will also be okay. So that's my major reason for wanting to speak on social work education. Now, to begin by stating the obvious, which is that social work education has two prongs, classroom instruction and, of course, the practical fieldwork. I know that with many institutions, there is more emphasis on the education than on the practical aspect, unfortunately. And that's hence I say that, it's unfortunate that the training part, the practice part is treated as a poor cousin in many institutions. I have been privileged to be external examiner to 13 institutions in Africa. And I have taken particular interest in how they are running their programs. And, in a couple of instances, I actually came across institutions where they are offering a program without practical part, So practical fieldwork or practicum, has been a major issue. The presentation really is predicated on some work that we did in 2009. We did, I mentioned there that 3 institutions participated, including the University of Johannesburg, University of Botswana, and the National University of Lesotho. I should quickly mention that at the University of Johannesburg, we worked with Professor Laila Patel. So it was really the center for social development in Africa that we worked with. And we came up with a report which was published. It's titled Developmental Social Work Education in Southern and East Africa. So my comments are really based on the experience from that study, although I did further work later on, which kind of confirmed what we had found out. So we were interested in establishing the extent to which institutions in this region have embraced the developmental social work approach. Let's move on to the next slide. Mm-hmm. Yes, and one of the troubling findings that came out of that study was that, many institutions said they were promoting, or moving in the direction of developmental social work. But what we found out was that there was an apparent mismatch between theory, what happens in the classroom, and the practice. One of the challenges was you would find, yes, the institution is trying its best to go developmental, as it were. But when it came to practice, when students are meant to go on practical, there was no opportunity to really sit down and think whether this practicum will be consistent with the expectations of a developmental approach. As we move on to the next stage, I just put the definition there from James Midgley and Connolly, definition of developmental social work, which says, some call it a social development approach, but it says it emphasizes the importance of social investment in professional social work practice. The investments are meant to meet the material needs of social work clients and facilitate their full integration into the social and economic life of the community. This is how James Midgley, whom we know is one of the foremost scholars in the field of social work, that's how they defined it. We were very interested, we found it rather interesting that some institutions actually said they didn't know what developmental social work is all about. So that's why they were not offering it. Or that's why they were not moving in that direction. Others said, yeah, we may have interest, but the institution itself is fixated on the remedial approach, so there is no way for us to move in the direction of developmental social work. So there was limited appreciation of the concept. Others would say, well, when it came to field work, there was the problem that there was shortage of qualified field supervisors or supervisors who had a clear picture of what the developmental approach was all about. In other words, they were content with the conventional approaches, if you like. But the previous speaker said, the emphasis today should be on focusing on structural changes, and the structural changes go hand in hand with a developmental approach. So it does not make good sense for an institution to say we are promoting developmental social work while they are sending their students to, the normal, you're promoting developmental approach, but everyone is emphasizing on counseling or casework, that kind of thing. So there is an important issue there. And I say there is need for social work institutions in Africa to begin to think outside the box. In other words, to be innovative, to be creative in an effort to offer meaningful field placement, especially if the institution is promoting a developmental social work approach. So, my paper is really, trying to introduce or trying to give a few examples of innovations that people can begin to think about if they are going to come up with field placements that are relevant to developmental social work approach. And I have 6 examples that I want to share with you. And I must mention that some of these examples were thought of many years ago. It's just that people have not emphasized them. And I should also mention that it is possible that some institutions may be doing some of what I'm going to share here. But I am sharing this because I've put together all the 6 examples of placements that are innovative, placements that are outside the box, if you like. So the first example that I have is what was termed this workshop placement. This is one way of coming up with a placement that is developmental. And Kendall talked about this a long time ago. This was 1974 when she talked about this. And this was in the context of the US, very interesting, And I am saying, it's an idea well worth revisiting. The workshop type of field placement, and I understand it was tried out in Latin America, and the strategy involved groups of students with one or two staff members being assigned to non-structured open field placements. Remember, the title of my presentation is Rethinking Fieldwork in the search for relevance. We are trying to find the kind of field placement that can be relevant to our African context, especially since we are talking of Ubuntu and indigenization and things like that. I am saying, this type, the workshop type, might be one good example of a placement which we may want to consider. According to Kendall, the locale for such a placement might be a squatter slum, a center for agrarian reform, a cooperative, a particular neighborhood. So you're taking your students there, and they are involved in what you might call workshops as part of their field placement. And we're saying such strategies help unravel some problems that are hidden in the community. I put down their gender-based violence because that's something I'm very passionate about. Another example 2, is what Kendall again called the floating placement, which I understand was tried out in the Philippines. So this is another innovative type of field placement which an institution can think about. Some of these strategies that I'm talking about here may come in very handy because some organizations today are reluctant to accept students because of the COVID situation, because they will say, our office is small, so we cannot, take students at this time. But if you are going out there in the community, the floating one, which is the second example, is also non-structured. It suggests students might not be stationed in one place. They will move, from one area to another for the duration of the placement. So that's number 2. As we move on to number 3, the third one, Jacob, yes, thank you. The village camping approach, this is another innovative type of placement which is consistent with a developmental social work approach. These 2 authors in 1986, Bogo and Harrington, they described what this is all about. They indicated that the strategy involves selecting on the basis of some kind of criteria, maybe poverty state or whatever it might be. You target one or more villages, and your students, your group, you might have 20, 30 students. They take residence in that village, and they can actually begin to do different things. Some may be focusing on education, others on health issues, others on welfare, maybe income generating projects, things like that. Activities may also include family therapy to individual or group or community research, action research, things like that. So students will be camped in one village. Students on such a placement could also get involved in community improvement activities, including adult education. They might even start an evening class, for those that are not literate, and that will move like that. The fourth example is working with communities. For lack of a better concept, term, I called it working with communities approach. I understand this was tried at Makerere University. I don't know whether it is still happening or whether, you know, it has taken a new form. If we have anybody from Makerere, you know, it would be nice to hear how they are doing it, if they are still doing it. I know the University of Zambia used to have something which was more or less along the same lines, if my memory serves me right, where they would take a group of students into some community out there for field work. But Ankara here states that whether in the traditional agency or the clear formulation of expectations and objectives seemed to pave the way for familiarity or participating in more development-aimed programs than experienced hitherto. In other words, when they were using this approach, there was more focus on development kind of programs, which is something that's consistent with developmental social work. She reports that this innovative idea was tried, as I said, at Makerere, and it had considerable success. Let's look at number 5. Number 5 is what Jennings has referred to as group block. Many of these, you may think actually it's only differences in name, but you know, when you do an investigation, you may find there are small differences here and there. So Jennings describes a field instruction which involves 8-week group block field placement in a community where students live, eat, and work together. They work together with community members and also with some training teams that might be there. So the difference might be, whereas the other approaches, the students are having their own meals out there. But here, in this one, it's talking of living with community members, eating with community members, and working with them. It's like some kind of participatory research. Students are required to undertake a range of different activities, and they work and learn as members of smaller teams comprising other students, community members, and professionals. The model success depends on carefully designed field experiences being grounded in community practices, coordinated by well-established community curricula for the classroom experience, and includes greater balance between prevention, development, and remediation. So this is number 5. And then the last one is something that some of you may be familiar with, which has been tried out in the Western world, actually, the long arm practice supervision. And looking at our situation, especially the COVID thing, this approach may also be well worth considering. Strategy for practical fieldwork training, which has been tried at a number of institutions, including Christchurch. It refers to an arrangement in which a supervisor is located at a distance. That's where the issue is. The supervisor is at a distance to the practice site. So the practice site might be, very far away. And you might not, as supervisor, you might not even have an opportunity to visit the actual placement, but you can perhaps do it by remote control, if you like, supervising maybe using your cell phone or whatever it might be. but the supervisor takes full responsibility of supervision and supporting the students. And it may be one student, it may be many students who may be doing their placement out there. But there is emphasis there for the supervisor. They are expected to use their own judgment when selecting appropriate learning opportunities for the student. The student may choose an area, but you have to sit down with the students to determine what is possible in terms of learning. What are the advantages of these approaches in the context of innovative developmental approaches? For theory and practical experiences to be properly aligned, there would be need for proper planning. You know, it's not a question of just sending students out there, just, abandoning them in the field. You need to sit and talk to them and come up with a clear, determine whether there is a learning experience that can come out of that. Innovative placements have to be very carefully thought through, especially in terms of objectives and also the outcomes. That will be helpful, because if you don't do that, the students may actually go out and sit under trees and do nothing. But Kendall, some years ago, 1974, said such placements are rooted in life as it exists in the community and are mainly aimed to address macro issues. And when we talk of macro issues, we are talking of a developmental approach. Because that is where macro practice is really considered key. Okay, let's look at a few more advantages. Emphasis is on self-directed learning. So this goes for maturity on the part of the student, because self-directed learning is not for those that are used to spoon feeding. Staff members may visit, or occasionally maybe once or twice, but there is need to leave room for creativity, originality, and innovativeness, for the student, on the part of the student. Jennings states that unless tension between focusing on the individual change and working as an advocate for development and social change is acknowledged and addressed, the complexity required by a community orientation will ensure it remains secondary to a remedial approach. In other words, if you don't do things the right way, there will be problems. So these are some of the ideas that I thought I would share with us in regard to thinking outside the box. I say the topic is rethinking our fieldwork experiences. And I've shared there 6 examples of ways in which we can be innovative as we search for a developmental approach to social work. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you, my distinguished professor. Such a nice and lucid presentation about fieldwork experiences across African region. Apparently, it's so lucid, it's so huge for me, because I'm a practitioner. I know what I face when students come to my hospital. I mean, University College Hospital. I know how I have to sit them down and be more Afrocentric instead of them telling me what is happening in Britain or probably in the US. Yes, understand, but the truth of the matter is that we are Africans, and if we are Africans, we must be African in nature. Thank you for those noble ideas. So